Picture a job whose entire purpose is getting beaten for someone else's mistakes. Not metaphorically, literally. Another child misbehaves, skips a lesson, breaks something, talks back to a tutor, and you're the one who gets punished. Regularly, for years, until that other child finally grows up. It sounds like something dreamed up by a particularly cruel novelist, but a version of this practice really did exist at some European courts, and the reason it existed says far more about the nature of monarchy than any coronation ever could. The problem this job solved was very specific. A future king's body was considered almost sacred, and striking it, even with a switch, even over a badly memorized Latin lesson, wasn't treated as ordinary discipline, but something bordering on blasphemy against the very idea of royal authority. A tutor who dared raise a hand against a prince risked far more than his job. He risked his head, since punishing an heir touched the entire concept of the divine right of kings. And yet, princes, as it turns out, behaved like perfectly ordinary children, lazy, mischievous, careless with property, and raising a future monarch with zero possibility of physical punishment in an age when the switch was the standard teaching tool for every other child was next to impossible. The solution people landed on was elegant and unsettling in equal measure. If you can't punish the prince himself, punish the person standing next to him. A boy roughly the prince's age, usually from a noble but not especially powerful family, was assigned to grow up and study right alongside the future king. Same tutors, same palace, same fencing and riding lessons, sometimes even the same bedroom. Families went along with this willingly because the calculation was purely practical. Proximity to a future monarch from childhood was worth more than any amount of physical discomfort. For a family without vast wealth or influence, it was one of the few real investments available, trading a few years of a son's discomfort for decades of potential influence at court. The price was that whenever the prince misbehaved, the punishment, often physical, a switch or a belt, landed on this boy instead of the heir. The reasoning behind it from the tutor side was just as calculated. They hoped that watching a friend suffer for his own mistakes would instill in the prince a stronger sense of guilt and empathy than feeling pain himself ever could. After all, people forget their own pain faster than they forget knowing someone else suffered because of them. It was an attempt to build a sense of responsibility through shame and social pressure on a child's closest relationship, rather than through fear of personal punishment. The best documented example of this practice involves the English King Charles I, whose whipping boy was William Murray. And here, the story takes an unexpected turn. This relationship didn't always curdle into resentment. Murray and the future Charles I effectively grew up as close friends, and once Charles took the throne, Murray became one of his most trusted courtiers, was granted the title Earl of Dysart, and remained an influential figure at court throughout the king's reign. Not a bad career outcome for someone who'd been periodically whipped as a child for crimes that weren't his. Some historians cautiously point to similar episodes at the French court and in a few German principalities, though none of that evidence comes close to the documentary certainty of the Murray and Charles case. Perhaps the reason for the friendship is simple. The whipping boy was the one person in the prince's world who talked to him not as a future monarch, but simply as a peer and fellow student, someone who quite literally paid every day for his mistakes. That said, an important caveat belongs right here. Documented evidence for the systematic, widespread use of whipping boys as a formal court institution is actually far thinner than popular culture suggests. Most sources are either isolated cases like Murray's or later literary accounts that happily dramatize the practice for effect. The single biggest contributor to popularizing the image was Mark Twain's novel The Prince and the Pauper, built around the boy punished for the misdeeds of the future King Edward VI, a work of fiction so convincing that it lodged itself in the popular imagination as historical fact, even though Twain himself was drawing more on rumor and legend than on any documented institution with clear rules. So the most likely reality sits somewhere in the middle. The practice existed in isolated cases at particular courts, but it was almost certainly never the universal custom across Europe that popular retellings sometimes suggest. The practice itself, to whatever extent it formally existed, faded gradually alongside a broader shift in attitudes towards corporal punishment in aristocratic upbringing. By the 18th century, under the influence of thinkers like John Locke, who argued directly against the switch as an educational tool, physically punishing children of any background, including punishment by proxy, increasingly came to look backward rather than wise. A court that had once engineered elaborate workarounds to avoid ever touching a prince with a switch simply stopped beating children altogether, and the need for the position quietly disappeared on its own. And yet, the idea proved to be such a sharp metaphor that it outlived the practice by centuries. Today, whipping boy is a standard idiom for anyone who takes the blame for someone else's mistakes, a subordinate fired in place of the executive who made the bad call, or a middle-level manager sacrificed after a failed product launch, even though the decision that caused the disaster was made several levels above. In that sense, a medieval court unintentionally handed the language a remarkably precise image for something that existed long before whipping boys ever did. Power has a talent for shifting the consequences of its own mistakes onto whoever's standing closest by, and has far less power to resist it.